What happens when a black doctor, mistakenly seen as just another outsider, is stopped by police outside the hospital, only to reveal he's the very person in charge of it all? This shocking encounter is a powerful reminder of how prejudice blinds even the most well-meaning, and how true leadership rises above assumptions. It was just another busy morning at St. Anthony's Hospital, where the rhythm of urgent footsteps, ringing phones, and the steady beeping of machines created a familiar soundtrack of medical life. Nurses hustled through corridors, doctors exchanged quick words of advice, and patients filled the waiting rooms with anxious murmurs. The air was heavy with the unspoken weight of tension that often lingered in the air of this city, an area known for its complex community dynamics. Dr. Elijah Carter, a distinguished black doctor in his late 30s, stepped through the hospital's front entrance, briefcase in hand, his expression calm but focused. His reputation had been built on years of hard work, precision, and compassion, yet he was still no stranger to the occasional raised eyebrow, the whisper behind closed doors, and the skepticism that followed his every step. Today, however, he was unaware that the casual breeze of a morning shift would soon be interrupted by an encounter that would challenge not only his identity, but also the prejudices deeply ingrained within the fabric of the community. The hospital, a place of healing, sat at the heart of a city where race relations were fraught, and suspicion toward certain individuals ran deep, even among those sworn to protect and serve. As Dr. Carter walked briskly toward the entrance of the hospital, his focus was solely on the tasks awaiting him. He barely noticed the two police officers standing near the curb until they suddenly approached him. The taller officer, a middle-aged man with a stern face, stepped forward. "Hey you, what are you doing here?" he demanded, his tone sharp and condescending. Dr. Carter paused, slightly taken aback by the abruptness of the question. "I'm on my way to work," he replied, his voice calm, but carrying a trace of confusion. The officer narrowed his eyes, looking him up and down with suspicion. "Work, huh? At this hour?" He motioned to his partner, who stood silently by, arms crossed, waiting for an explanation. "You don't look like someone who belongs here. You got ID on you?" Before Dr. Carter could respond, the second officer stepped forward, adding in a dismissive tone, "Probably just another low-level worker or a visitor trying to hang around." They demanded to see his identification, accusing him of loitering despite his calm demeanor and professional attire. The officers' hostile manner intensified, their disbelief growing that anyone, especially a black man, could be a doctor at such a prominent hospital. Dr. Carter, trying to maintain composure, offered to show his ID, but the tension in the air was palpable. Dr. Carter's heart raced, but his exterior remained composed. Years of training and dealing with stressful situations had honed his ability to stay calm under pressure. He could feel the sting of the officers' assumptions, their disbelief clouding the air around him, but he refused to let them see his frustration. He took a deep breath and, in a level tone, said, "I'm Dr. Elijah Carter. I'm the new cardiologist here. If you need further verification, I'd be happy to provide it." The taller officer seemed unmoved, his eyes scanning Dr. Carter's face for any sign of hesitation or guilt. But Dr. Carter didn't flinch. He knew the game they were playing, one rooted in bias, not reason, and he wasn't about to give them the satisfaction of seeing him rattled. Without another word, he reached into his bag and retrieved his hospital ID, offering it to them. But the officers didn't take it right away. They stared at him for a moment longer, their skepticism still hanging thick in the air. Instead of engaging further, Dr. Carter straightened his posture and, with a subtle nod, continued walking toward the hospital. He didn't need to argue or raise his voice. He had a higher purpose, and he wasn't about to let their small-mindedness derail him. As Dr. Carter entered the hospital, he was greeted by a flurry of activity at the entrance. A group of hospital staff, including nurses, administrators, and a few senior physicians, were gathered, waiting for him. Their warm smiles and handshakes were a stark contrast to the cold, dismissive attitude he'd just encountered outside. "Good morning, Dr. Carter." One of the senior staff members greeted him with a firm handshake. "We're all looking forward to having you lead us today." Carter offered a calm smile, nodding in acknowledgement. "Thank you. Let's get started," he replied, his voice steady and professional. The officers who had trailed behind him at a distance froze as they overheard the conversation. The taller officer's gaze shifted from Dr. Carter to the group, the pieces finally clicking into place. One of the hospital officials turned to the officer, noticing the confusion on his face. "Dr. Carter, our director," the official said, introducing him to the group. The officer's expression shifted from suspicion to disbelief. He had been questioning the very person who was in fact in charge of all clinical operations. As the realization hit him, his face drained of color. The weight of his mistake was undeniable, and for a moment, the air felt thick with his own shame. The silence that followed was thick with discomfort. One of the senior staff members, Dr. Melanie Graves, who had been standing closest to the officers, stepped forward. She had witnessed the entire encounter and couldn't let it go unnoticed. Her expression was stern, but her voice remained calm as she addressed the officers. "Excuse me, officers," Dr. Graves said, her gaze unwavering. "How could you have mistaken Dr. Carter for someone else? What made you think he wasn't here on business?" She gestured toward the hospital entrance, where the staff had gathered. "This is Dr. Elijah Carter, the Director of Clinical Operations. He's been with us for years, working tirelessly to make this hospital a better place. He's not just a doctor, he's a leader in our community." The officers shifted uncomfortably, unsure of how to respond. Dr. Carter stood nearby, his posture calm but his eyes burning with quiet strength. He didn't raise his voice or demand an apology. Instead, he turned to the officers and, in a composed tone, spoke for everyone to hear. "I've worked for years to get to this position," he said, his voice carrying over the murmurs. "But none of that matters if people like you continue to judge others based on the color of their skin." His words cut through the tension, leaving no room for defense. The air was heavy with tension as the officers stood in stunned silence. Their earlier bravado had evaporated, replaced by the weight of their embarrassment. The taller officer cleared his throat, his words faltering as he muttered, We apologize, Dr. Carter. We didn't know." His partner nodded, looking away, avoiding Dr. Carter's piercing gaze. Dr. Carter said nothing in response, his calm demeanor unwavering. The damage, however, had already been done. His colleagues, who had witnessed the entire interaction, stood firmly beside him, offering silent solidarity. Some exchanged glances, while others made subtle gestures of support. Dr. Graves, who had confronted the officers earlier, placed a reassuring hand on Dr. Carter's shoulder. The officers, realizing the depth of their misjudgment, nodded and slowly turned away. They walked to their squad car, avoiding the eyes of the gathered hospital staff, who continued to watch them with a mixture of disappointment and disbelief. Without another word, they left the scene, their presence a reminder of the biases they had just displayed. Dr. Carter watched them go, feeling a bitter blend of vindication and sadness. He had proven his worth, but it pained him that such an incident could still happen in today's world. With a deep breath, he entered the hospital, ready to return to his important work, knowing that the battle for equality wasn't over. As Dr. Carter walked through the hospital's halls, the events of the morning lingered in his mind. His encounter with the officers was a harsh reminder of the systemic issues that continue to affect people of color, even those in positions of power and authority. Despite his success, despite his years of dedication and sacrifice, he had still been judged by the color of his skin. It was a reality he knew all too well, one that countless others experienced daily. People who, like him, had to prove themselves over and over, simply to be seen as equals. But Dr. Carter wasn't a man who let ignorance define him. His achievements spoke for themselves, and in that moment he had risen above the prejudice that sought to diminish his worth. He had silently challenged assumptions, proving that outward appearances could be deceiving. He was more than the assumptions others placed on him. He was a leader, a mentor, and a doctor who had earned his place. His story wasn't just about personal triumph. It was about the quiet revolution that occurs when someone rises above the biases of the world, using their success to challenge those who refuse to see beyond the surface. Dr. Carter's journey was far from over, but he had made his point clear. Change comes when we stop judging others by the color of their skin and start recognizing the value they bring.